Welcome to Silent Screams, where chilling tales come to life. Tonight, we dive into 6 true scary kidnapping horror stories that will send shivers down your spine. The rain was relentless, pounding against the windows like desperate hands trying to break through the glass. Olivia sat quietly in the back seat of her parents' car, her headphones on, drowning out the storm with music. The road ahead was barely visible, the headlights of the car casting an eerie glow on the wet asphalt as her father navigated the winding mountain pass. They were heading home from a family weekend getaway in the countryside, a trip meant to escape the monotony of their daily lives. But Olivia couldn't shake a strange feeling that had settled in her stomach, a gnawing unease that refused to leave her alone. She glanced at her parents. Her mother was staring out the passenger side window, her face lit intermittently by the crackling bursts of lightning that illuminated the forest outside. Her father was focused on the road, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel tightly. Olivia pulled her hoodie tighter around her and closed her eyes, trying to shake the feeling. She told herself it was just the storm, the darkness, and the endless trees. They made everything feel ominous. But the pit in her stomach only grew heavier. Suddenly, the car jerked violently to the side. Olivia's eyes flew open as her father swore loudly, wrestling with the steering wheel. The car skidded on the slick road before coming to a jarring halt. The headlights illuminated something lying in the middle of the road, something large and unmoving. Olivia squinted, her heart pounding as she leaned forward to get a better look. It was a car, flipped on its side, smoke rising from the wreckage. The sight was surreal, the kind of scene you'd only expect to see in a movie. "We need to help," her father muttered, already unbuckling his seatbelt. Her mother nodded, her face pale but resolute. Olivia felt her stomach drop. The unease she had felt earlier now roared into full-blown dread. "Stay in the car, Olivia," her mother said firmly, her voice trembling slightly as she opened her door. The cold, wet air rushed in, sending a shiver down Olivia's spine. She wanted to protest, to tell them not to go, but her voice caught in her throat. She watched as her parents hurried toward the wreckage, their figures silhouetted against the storm. The rain hammered down harder, the sound deafening inside the car. Olivia leaned forward, trying to see what was happening, but the rain blurred everything. She fumbled with the car door, opening it just a crack to hear better. Her parents' voices were faint, shouting back and forth, but she couldn't make out the words. Then came a sound she would never forget, a piercing scream that tore through the night, cutting through the storm like a blade. "Mom? Dad?" Olivia shouted, fear gripping her chest as she threw the door open and stepped out into the rain. Her clothes were soaked instantly, the cold biting into her skin as she stumbled toward the wreckage. The headlights of their car barely reached her parents now, but she could see their shapes moving frantically. And then they stopped. Both figures froze in place, their heads snapping towards something deeper in the woods. Olivia followed their gaze, her breath catching in her throat as she saw what they were looking at. There, just beyond the tree line, stood a figure. It was barely visible in the shadows, but its presence was undeniable. The figure was tall and motionless, its face obscured by the dark. "Run!" Her father's voice roared through the storm, snapping Olivia out of her trance. But before she could move, the figure began to step forward. Its movements were slow, deliberate, each step echoing in her ears despite the thunder and rain. Olivia felt rooted to the spot, her body refusing to obey her mind's desperate commands to flee. Her parents turned and sprinted toward her, their faces contorted with terror. "Go. Get in the car," her mother screamed, grabbing Olivia's arm and shoving her toward the vehicle. But before any of them could reach it, a blinding light flooded the area. Olivia shielded her eyes, her heart hammering in her chest. When the light faded, the figure was gone. "What the hell was that?" her father panted, pulling Olivia and her mother toward the car. But before they could climb in, the sound of an engine roared to life behind them. Olivia turned, her eyes widening as another car sped down the road, its headlights piercing through the storm. It didn't stop. The car barreled toward them, forcing them to dive out of the way as it skidded to a stop just inches from the wreckage. 3 men climbed out, their faces obscured by dark hoods. They moved quickly, their movements sharp and calculated. Olivia's father shouted at them, waving his arms, but the men ignored him. Instead, one of them turned toward Olivia, his gaze locking onto hers. Even from the distance, she could feel the malice in his eyes. "Run," her father shouted again, his voice desperate. But before Olivia could move, one of the men raised something, a long, sharp object that gleamed even in the dim light. The storm seemed to grow louder, the world spinning around her as she was dragged to her feet by her mother. Together, they stumbled toward the woods, their breaths ragged and panicked. Behind them, the sound of footsteps grew louder, closer. Olivia's heart raced as she glanced over her shoulder, her stomach lurching at the sight of the men chasing after them. And then, just as they reached the edge of the forest, she saw it again, the figure. It was closer now, its features barely visible in the flickering light of the storm. Its eyes glowed faintly, and its mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. For a moment, Olivia thought it was watching the men, not her. But then it turned its gaze toward her. The woods swallowed them whole, the darkness wrapping around them like a suffocating blanket. The only sounds were their labored breaths and the relentless pounding of rain. Olivia's mother clung to her, whispering words of comfort that did little to ease the terror coursing through her veins. Her father led the way, his flashlight cutting a narrow path through the trees. But no matter how far they ran, Olivia couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Not just by the men chasing them, but by something else, something darker. She didn't know how much time had passed before the sound of footsteps faded, replaced by an oppressive silence. Her father slowed, his flashlight trembling in his hand as he turned to face them. "Did we lose them?" Olivia whispered, her voice barely audible. Her father didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on something behind them, his face pale and stricken with fear. Olivia turned slowly, her blood turning to ice as she saw what he was looking at. The figure was there again, standing impossibly still, its glowing eyes burning into hers. Then it stepped forward,